Tensions mount between Israel and Hezbollah at the southern Lebanese border. Will the conflict in Gaza escalate to a much wider conflict? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Nearly 9 months into the conflict in Gaza, nearly 38,000 people have died, almost 87,000 have been wounded, and almost 2 million people displaced. Sigrid Kaag, the United Nations Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, spoke at a UN Security Council meeting on Tuesday.
The war has not merely created the most profound of humanitarian crises, it has unleashed a maelstrom of human misery. The public health system, as you know, has collapsed, schools destroyed, and the disrupted education system threatens acutely future generations. With summer temperatures soaring and severe shortages of basic services such as waste management, sanitation facilities and water supplies, the spectre of outbreaks of infectious and communicable diseases looms large.
Meanwhile, fighting between the Israeli Defense Forces and Hezbollah has increased at the Lebanon Israel border. Many are concerned that Israel is getting in position for an invasion into Lebanon, which could possibly escalate into a larger regional conflict. There is much to discuss. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Andrew Parasiliti is the President and Chief Content Officer of Al Monitor. Here in our studio, Edmund Garib is an academic and Middle East expert, and in Seattle, Richard Silverstein is a journalist for the blog Tikkun Olam. Welcome to all of you to the show. Andrew, let me start with you, and let's talk about the situation on the Lebanon-Israel border. We've seen the warning signs for months now. Hezbollah have been hitting targets inside Israel. We've seen large parts at the northern border being evacuated. That's Israel has evacuated residents from those areas. What is your assessment of what the situation is like right now?
We're in a situation of high risk. Both sides claim they do not want the conflict to escalate. The Biden administration has been working very hard to try to get both sides to step back. But in the meantime, the skirmishes continue on the border, and they are lethal. Israel has penetrated deeply into Lebanon. It has suffered 16 deaths in terms of the military, 11 civilians. Hezbollah and the Lebanese have suffered more. There have been 450 casualties, most of them reportedly Hezbollah forces, but also Israel has hit a lot of towns and infrastructure. The challenge there is that while both sides are saying they don't want the conflict to grow, when you keep hitting each other, you never know what the trigger or the match could be that could lead to a wider escalation. It's also interesting to note that while Hezbollah has taken more damage so far in this conflict, it has also gained a kind of strategic edge in the sense that, as you noted in the initial report, that thousands of Israelis have been displaced from northern Israel because of the regular shelling by Hezbollah and the increased capabilities there. And this has created a great pressure on the Israeli government, on Prime Minister Netanyahu's government, to do something about it. So this conflict, again, both sides say they don't want it. The Biden administration is working hard to try to prevent it. But boy, there's also a lot of pressure and possibility that this could escalate further.
Edmund, what do you make of what's going on the border right now? Israel is already moving its forces to the northern border. We've already seen Israeli jets that are targeting parts of southern Lebanon. And in fact, the Israelis have threatened to reduce Lebanon to what Gaza is right now. And how would you assess Hezbollah's strength? Because they've been making some very confident pronouncements about their ability to take on the Israelis.
That's a very good question. I think, first of all, the situation is becoming much more explosive. We're seeing escalation. There have been, at least from the beginning, there were tensions even before Gaza. But on both sides. The Israelis would attack sometimes. There were some assassinations. We also saw, on the other hand, sometimes there were also some small attacks against Israel before that. But I think the Gaza conflict, the Gaza war, has changed the environment. Yet, despite that, despite the escalation that we saw in Gaza, there was at least a balance in the attitudes and the policies of both the Israelis and Hezbollah. They both tried to, it was like a tit-for-tat. If you escalate a little bit, I'll do the same on my side. And that's what we began to see on both sides. And however, it has been escalating, yet it has been, so far, neither side at least appears to want to escalate. But recently, in the last few weeks, I think we've seen more and heard more about escalation. And the danger, I think, is real. Now, why? Because, first of all, the Israelis have the capability to do a lot of damage to Lebanon, a lot of destruction to Lebanon. As you pointed out, they have warned that Beirut and other cities could be, what happened in Gaza could be repeated there. Nevertheless, I think Hezbollah is also has a lot of capabilities. They could do a lot of damage to the Israelis. And that's why, one, there's the concern. That's why there is the hesitation also on the part of the Israelis. Because Hezbollah, yes, it does not have Israel's advanced and sophisticated weapons, but they have enough weapons to do damage to the infrastructure.
Right, and very briefly, what do you make of the fact that Israel has had to evacuate parts of northern Israel? In fact, the border at one stage was 35 kilometers into Israel.
Well, there's been, exactly, but it's been on both sides. There have been about somewhere, we don't know the exact figure, somewhere between 60 to 80,000 Israelis who were forced to leave the area, and there have been somewhere around 80 to maybe 100,000 Lebanese. So basically, that's another aspect that is very, very concerning for both sides. The Israelis have been asking that Hezbollah be moved 10 or 15 kilometers. But I don't think that's likely to happen. Hezbollah has said that they were not going to stop until the end, the ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire takes place in Gaza.
Richard, great to have you with us. Richard, the Israeli Foreign Minister, Israel Katz, he said in a social media post this week, and I'm quoting him here, he said, "A regime that threatens destruction deserves to be destroyed." And his threat was directed at Iran, which recently said through its mission at the United Nations that there would be, quote, "an obliterating war." If there is a full-scale Israeli invasion of Lebanon, are we sitting on the cusp of what could be a much wider conflict?
Absolutely. I think that many of the developments of the past 7 or 8 months have taken us much closer to a regional war. We had the exchange of missiles after Israel assassinated a top IRG, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, commander in Damascus, when Iran sent 300 missiles toward Israel, and Israel and its allies in the region defended against them and destroyed most of them. But that was just almost a theatrical, orchestrated a situation. And in a situation where Israel invades Lebanon, which I think is quite likely in the coming weeks and possibly months, Iran will not signal that it's going to send those missiles. It will merely launch them. Hezbollah will do the same. And I just want to add a bit of nuance to what your previous guests have said. I believe that Israel does want a war with Lebanon. If you look back to October 8th, the day after the Hamas attack, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said, before we attack Gaza, I think we should attack Hezbollah in Lebanon because they're a much more dangerous enemy. So I think there is a willingness and even an eagerness on the part of Israel to get to that, to possibly wind down Gaza and send its forces north. And the IDF just today in the New York Times said that it wants a ceasefire regardless of what Netanyahu wants. And they are doing that because they want to prepare for a war with Lebanon.
Right, and Richard, can Israel launch this war with the troops that it has at the moment? Because we've heard the defense minister say that another 10,000 troops are needed. In fact, they've one of the laws in Israel that protects one particular the Haredim, the Orthodox Jews, from fighting, they can now be called into the defense force. What does that tell us?
Well, the generals in the New York Times article today said that they want to wind down the fighting in Gaza, even if Hamas continues to control Gaza. And they want to do that because they need their troops in Gaza to recuperate and to resume their training and to get ready for an attack on Lebanon. So I think a certain amount of time will be required to move those troops out and get them ready for an invasion in the north, as they had to do before they attacked Gaza after October 7th. So I think we are in that mode. We are exchanging fire between both sides and pretty serious damage, especially not just on the Lebanese side, but but Hezbollah has fired missiles into Israel, attacking military bases. They've even been damaged or destroyed an Iron Dome battery. So we have a very serious situation militarily.
Okay, well, joining us now from Lisbon is John Gasvinian. He is the Executive Director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania. John, great to have you with us. John, the Financial Times reported that Kamal Karachi, he's the foreign affairs advisor to the Iranian leader, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, he said all Lebanese people, Arab countries, and members of the Axis of Resistance will support Lebanon. And that axis includes the Islamic resistance forces in Iraq, as well as in Syria, as well as the Houthis who are in Yemen. I mean, how do you see that? Is that just bluster, or could Iran be drawn into this conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we have to be very honest about where we find ourselves. There is a real confluence of factors right now that is highly dangerous. You know, on the one hand, you have an Israeli prime minister whose war is not being prosecuted in Gaza in exactly the way that he would have wanted. He has claimed from the beginning that the goal was to completely destroy, demolish, obliterate Hamas. That has not happened after many, many months. It's brought tremendous international condemnation and isolation onto Israel. You have in the United States a superpower with a president who is at best distracted and not seeming to be in a position to really be able to, you know, exert serious influence on the local actors. From the Iranian perspective, Hezbollah is a red line. You know, Hamas and Gaza, Iran has managed to do a pretty successful job of actually staying out for most of these past few months. But with all of these kinds of escalating military skirmishes between Israel and Hezbollah along the Lebanese border, it's becoming harder and harder for Iran to want to sort of sit this out. You know, as a previous guest alluded to, I think very rightly, up until now, you know, you did have this largely theatrical sort of exchange of fire between Israel and Iran, which was very frightening. But in many ways, I think where we are now, we see us, it's easy to see that as a sort of precursor to something much larger, much more frightening. And I think those comments about the regional dimension of this are something to be taken seriously.
Okay, I want to turn for a moment now to the situation in Gaza. Andrew, the Israeli onslaught in Gaza has not been stopped despite rulings from the International Court of Justice, and the efforts at a ceasefire have not come to anything. And as John pointed out a moment ago, the Israelis have not achieved their goals. After 9 months in Gaza, they've not been able to defeat Hamas. Nor have they been able to get their hostages out. And the United States, which is Israel's main financial and military backer, doesn't seem to have the power to stop what is going on, or maybe it's the United States is disinclined to stop what the Israelis are doing. But in the region, both the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu and the Hamas spokesman have released statements. Let's listen to what they had to say.
Our forces are operating in Rafah, in Shajaya, everywhere in the Gaza Strip. Every day they are eliminating dozens of terrorists.
There has been no real progress at the end of aggression negotiations, and what is quoted by the American administration is to put pressure on the Hamas movement to accept the Israel ceasefire proposal without modification.
So, Andrew, the Palestinian death toll, as we mentioned earlier, is now close to 40,000, 80,000 people wounded. We don't know the exact numbers. There could be tens of thousands of people buried under the rubble. And Israel has just ordered Palestinians in the town of Khan Yunis in Gaza to evacuate. Where do you see this heading?
Very difficult. First, to begin with the humanitarian situation in Gaza, the numbers are incredibly daunting in terms of what the people there are facing. There was also a report today that the UN has noticed that 80% of the population of Gaza, 1.9 million, has been displaced. Look, a lot of this has to do with internal Israeli politics. Prime Minister Netanyahu is not feeling the pressure from the United States, number one, to enact this ceasefire. And he does feel the pressure from the right flank of his government, which hold a number of seats, which, if that right flank withdrew from Netanyahu's coalition, could bring his government down. Obviously, there are many complexities and nuances to those decisions, but I think the only pressure that he's feeling at this point is, one, he hasn't achieved his war aims at this point. Two, there is also the pressure from the military. Previous speakers have alluded to this. There's concerns about the border in Lebanon. There's also concerns about the replenishment of munitions. The war in Gaza, whatever the political calculations of Netanyahu, has had a cost on the Israeli military, its reservists and others, and people are feeling that, and the military is feeling that, and there are concerns about what could be happening in the north. There is a debate, we reported it today at Al Monitor, among the IDF and other Israeli leaders, whether to, quote, wind down the operation in Gaza to more low-intensity operations that has seemed to be happening somewhat or tentatively in recent weeks, to perhaps prepare for what's happening in Lebanon and wait for re-ammunition or to receive increased ammunitions and munitions from the United States. And of course, there is the pressure of the families of Israelis and indeed some Israeli Americans who continue to be held hostage. I think the number is 116. I think 42 are presumed dead according to IDF calculations, but many in Israel want to see Prime Minister Netanyahu wind that down. So, as I say, there are a lot of competing pressures and influences, but at this point, Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision is to continue to go and to work toward an objective that may be unachievable, at least as he's described it so far.
Richard, I want to turn now to one other development which is getting a lot of traction in social media as well as in independent media. There have been a number of media reports about horrific prison conditions in Israel, the conditions under which Palestinian prisoners are being held. This week, the Israeli prison authorities released the director of the Al-Shifa hospital, Dr. Mohammed Abu Samaya, and this is what he had to say after he was freed. Let's listen.
We left behind many prisoners, tens of thousands of prisoners, living in hardship, experiencing psychological and physical torture that no Palestinian prisoner has experienced since the Nakba in 1948. Our brave prisoners are subjected to all kinds of torture behind bars. Even the older prisoners, who have spent tens of years in the occupation prisons, have been deprived of all their most basic rights. Many prisoners have died while they were in interrogation and were deprived of medicine and food.
So, Richard, has there been any response from the Israeli government on this?
Well, I think this is exactly what the Israeli government wants to happen. Itamar Ben-Gvir is the minister for the police. That includes the prison authorities. And this is exactly the kind of treatment that he wants these prisoners to endure. He has absolutely no sympathy, not a humanitarian bone in his body when it comes to the Palestinians. In fact, he made a statement this week saying that Palestinian prisoners should be executed. They're not quite doing that in the facility you mentioned, but they're doing everything short of that. The conditions are horrific, and they include rape and all sorts of other, beatings, and they're providing no substantial amount of food for these people. Relatively some gruel every day. There's seemingly no response from the Israeli public. There's no brakes put on or restraints put on the government in terms of what it's doing. And I even think, to an extent, the IDF saying they want to wind down the conflict and get ready for Lebanon may be a bit of theatrics itself, because the army does not want to be seen as the bad guy here. They would prefer to blame Netanyahu, who actually does deserve blame. It's horrific, the conditions that all the Palestinians in Gaza and the prisoners in Israel are facing.
And Edmund, if we look at the role of the United States in this, the United States, which has a great deal of influence over Israel, but seems to be completely AWOL when it comes to this conflict. I mean, the Washington Post reported that a senior United States defense intelligence official, who resigned last month actually because of the U.S. support for Israel, now he believes that Israel is waiting for a green light from President Biden to launch what he said was a full-scale ground invasion of Gaza, what was described as a war of annihilation.
This is a very, very good point, and this is really a question about, that's why we're seeing now almost the United States becoming isolated internationally as a result of the stance and the positions it has adopted towards the conflict. The President of the United States has been saying there are certain red lines, there's a red line, and every time Israel crosses the red line, we don't even know what the red line is. So basically what we are seeing right now is that I think Netanyahu and his government, especially those on the right wing, are exploiting what they believe is a weak moment in the United States, because the United States is very close to elections. And the elections, basically, he wants to prolong the war. He realizes that President Biden is not ready to put the kind of pressure which had been previously put on Israeli officials, whether it was people like President Eisenhower, whether it's in '56, whether it was even President Reagan, for that matter, President George Bush Sr. So all of this, he thinks now he can, this is an opportune time, because he's facing a lot of problems domestically as well as internationally. He wants to prolong the conflict as long as possible, and he maybe hopes that Trump would be a much better supporter than even Biden, who has been very strong supporter of Israel so far. So that makes it, I think, much more complicated, and it creates an environment that makes it that's what makes it much more dangerous, and what might lead to an explosion, regional explosion, primarily because I think this time we're hearing that the Iranians said that if Hezbollah is attacked, they would support the Hezbollah. We heard from Turkey stands with Lebanon. So basically there is going to be a much more dangerous and more explosive environment, unless there is a position on the part of the United States, a strong hand, and that I don't expect it to happen, actually. But there's only one other thing that I think is important that we are seeing now, and that is that we're seeing the United States again sending military ships to the region, sending a Marine regiment to the area. That's, again, is very dangerous. And that's what makes the situation much more explosive than we have seen it in a long time.
John, what is your reading of the situation in Gaza right now? As Edmund Grieb points out, you know, the United States is preoccupied with the election, also preoccupied with the health of President Biden and his mental capacity. President Biden, for one, has insisted that he will run for a second term, no matter what. And then, of course, the alternative is Donald Trump. And insofar as Gaza is concerned, Donald Trump says he will encourage Prime Minister Netanyahu to, in his words, finish the job.
Well, the Israelis have always been masters at timing, or at sort of understanding the timing of the U.S. Political cycles. Some of their largest offensive operations have been launched on days when the United States is in the midst of a massive domestic political news cycle, or even during large kind of American holidays like Christmas or New Year's or even the Super Bowl. They're very good at this. They do this kind of routinely, and I think they're doing this on a larger scale now over the next few months. they can, I mean, anyone can see, anyone in the world right now can see that the United States is unusually distracted. It would be too much to say that there's a sort of power vacuum in Washington. Of course, there are plenty of people from Anthony Blinken on down who are not exactly asleep on the job. However, the commander-in-chief appears to be asleep on the job. I mean, that is something that became visibly clear to the United States and to the world this week, and that has created a certain kind of atmosphere here. On top of which, of course, we have an already very volatile and uncertain political transition in the United States. And by the way, I don't think it's just the Israelis who are trying to take advantage of this. I think the Iranians are as well. They have a very complex transition of their own, of course, having just had a president die in a helicopter crash and calling a snap election. But with their nuclear program and in a lot of other ways, the Iranians are also, I think, trying to take advantage of this sort of mini sort of vacuum of American power.
Right. Andrew, I've just got a couple of minutes left, and it seems the United States is at a crucial moment right now as far as its policies in the Middle East are concerned. And, you know, look, if we look at the broader question of what the United States is doing there, I mean, what do you make of overall U.S. policy in the Middle East? I mean, they tried to persuade the Saudis to recognize Israel in return for some kind of defense pact. Egypt and Jordan are under pressure because of what's going on in Gaza right now. I mean, do you see any kind of coherent approach by the United States to what is going on in that part of the world?
I actually do, Anand. Realizing that the Gaza war has created incredible suffering and incredible risk throughout the region in terms of a wider conflict, the Biden administration has come forward with a plan, which is if and when this war ends and there is a ceasefire and an exchange of prisoners to get the hostages out, finally, out of Gaza, to enact a ceasefire, and to then move on to a post-war situation that would include a path to a Palestinian state. The region has bought in on this. This is a Biden plan.
Right.
And at the end of the prize, at the end for Israel, would be normalization with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
The decision point in all of this comes back to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's not going to make any decision that's going to undermine his political situation, and he can't do a deal if he's not in power.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.